Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour, tout le monde. See, we have some lounge music playing. No, it's stopped. Good. So now it's time to get serious. So I'm Patricia Fuller, Canada's Ambassador for Climate Change, and I will be moderating this afternoon's event with my British colleague, Nick Bridge, who is the Special Representative of the United Kingdom for Climate Change. So welcome to all of you. Very pleased to have you here for this discussion around powering past coal. So in 2017, Canada and the United Kingdom launched the Powering Past Coal Alliance with 27 members, and we are now over double that. And in fact, that number will grow further tomorrow. So we're very excited about that, and those of you attending the main stage event tomorrow will get to hear about the next phase of the growth of this alliance. So this is an important conversation. We have a fantastic panel here this afternoon to speak to you. And with over 40% of the world's electricity still generated from coal, this is really one of the most important and meaningful solutions to climate change, the phase out of unabated coal electricity. So over the next 2 hours, we'll talk about what the Alliance members are doing to transition from coal to clean electricity, some of the challenges that they have faced and overcome, and how we can use the gathering momentum of this alliance to advance even more action. For Canada's part, the Government of Canada is fully committed to reaching our Paris Agreement target for 2030 and finding meaningful solutions to get there. And we've put in place a comprehensive climate change plan that we're moving forward with, and that of course includes the phase out of traditional coal power by 2030. Indeed, a growing number of national governments, states, provinces, cities, and businesses agree that phasing out coal is not only achievable, but the right thing to do for our environment, our economy, and our health. Indeed, the shift from traditional coal electricity presents an enormous opportunity for more national and subnational governments to be part of the global clean growth opportunity worth trillions of dollars, $23 trillion between now and 2030, according to the World Bank. So organizations like the PPCA and events like this one at the Global Climate Action Summit are raising awareness about what it means to be part of the future and are critical to the success of our shared ambition to leave a better planet for generations to come. In a few minutes, we're going to see a film produced in collaboration with Bloomberg Philanthropies, with whom the PPCA is proud to be working. This collaboration is helping the PPCA build compelling international case studies and practical guidance to help governments and businesses transition away from coal. Phasing out coal could be one of the defining actions of our time in terms of protecting the environment. For those in the audience representing governments or businesses that are not yet members of PPCA, I hope that you will consider joining the Alliance and consider contributing to the larger goal of achieving a zero carbon economy. So thank you very much for being here today, and I will now ask my colleague Nick Bridge to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. So I'm Nick Bridge, the UK Government's Special Representative for Climate Change. Really delighted. Thank you, Bloomberg, Philanthropies, and Climate Works, and my Canadian colleagues for putting this on, and to all of you for coming. As Patricia says, there is simply no sustainable future for the planet without a more aggressive phase out of coal-powered energy generation. And very briefly, from a UK perspective, there is an incredibly compelling story around this. We've had the first coal power generation in the world. It powered the Industrial Revolution, and in 1800s it was central to our process. Many of you will know there was a day last year when we had no coal in our power generation for the first time since 1882. So that's now moved to several days. It's a shift that really tells you a bigger story about the end of one kind of industrial revolution and the beginning of another. And at the same time as doing that, we found we've become the biggest offshore wind power generator in the world. We produce 40% of the world's offshore wind now. It's all coming into the economy, it's getting into the grid, it's driving new electric vehicles, it's digitalization, it's smart grids, it's battery, it's hydrogen, everything is transforming. And so this drive out of coal is part of what stimulated the new industrial revolution. Now, every country is different. It has different challenges, economic, social, cultural, environmental. This is not a case of demonizing countries or doing things in that kind of way, but it's about saying we have to do it. We can only do it together. And so we brought this alliance together, the Canadian government and the UK government saying we found a way through this. It's been incredibly difficult in many ways. We'll hear a bit about that perhaps from colleagues on the panel. But we think it's the only way. So thank you so much again for everyone who's putting this on. I think we're going to hear some really exciting stories. And it falls to me now just to introduce Ailun Yang, who's going to say a few words, and I think we'll see a film. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today to introduce this video. This video is the first production of the partnership between the Powering Pasco Alliance and Bloomberg Philanthropies. We formed this partnership back in April in New York City. The idea of this partnership is to produce case studies to look at how communities, countries, business actually transition away from coal, recognizing it's not easy, but really what are the good practices, what are the good examples of that. And we think there's no better way to actually tell the story than making a video out of it. What you are about to see, let me give you a very quick preview of that. It's a small town in the state of Washington. The town is called Centralia, and there's a very big coal plant in the town, which is, of course, an important part of the local economy, but also a major polluting source. And also, there's intense negotiation around how to actually early retire this coal plant in a way that can also protect the local community. So this is a story about that. And what we hope to do with this kind of product is to show that actually this can be done, and that this can be done in a way that's sustainable, and this can be done in a way that really benefits our future, our climate, and our environment. So without any delay, I want to show you, but before that, let me also thank all the people who make this happen. I want to thank many of the NGO friends who, sitting there who actually work on that campaign. At the time, I want to also thank the team at ClimateWorks, at Transit Pictures, who produced this video in such a short period of time. The partnership was formed in April, and now we have this first product in September. I want to also give a very quick preview. Other than this video, we are also producing other more analytical products, and so hopefully people will continue to be in this fight together. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was a really great way of, I think, bringing that to life. Thanks, Aileen, and everybody involved in doing that. We're now going to move to the presentations, and we'll jump straight to the Honourable Leslie Griffiths, Minister in the Government of Wales in the United Kingdom, to hear the story from that part of the world. Leslie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Nick. Good afternoon, Prynhawn Da. I thought I'd start by saying a little bit about Wales for those of you who perhaps don't know much about us. So Wales is one of 4 nations in the United Kingdom, and we're probably most famous for rugby and our castles and our sporting achievements, particularly individual sporting achievements. And very often when I go somewhere and I say I'm from Wales, people look at me and go, Gareth Bale. And just last month, or actually the month before, I was in Bulgaria for a week, and I went through this with a local potter who said to me, Geraint Thomas, because of course Geraint Thomas had just won the Tour de France. So I think that's probably what Wales is most famous for. But of course, we were absolutely at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, and we have a very proud manufacturing history. Our National Assembly for Wales, our Parliament, where we make decisions for the people of Wales, is just a short walk from the Coal Exchange in Cardiff. This is a very iconic building, and it was once the hub of the global coal trade. It was when Cardiff was the biggest coal port in the world. And here in 1904, the first £1 million deal in history was done, and the very first £1 million cheque was signed. Coal mines provided jobs for Valley's communities, and mining is part of our cultural history. In the 1920s, there were over 600 coal mines in Wales, and it employed over 250,000 people. And at that time, we were only a country of 2.5 million people. Our energy system was almost exclusively coal-powered. But now coal extraction has virtually disappeared in Wales. The last coal-fired power station in Wales will close before 2025. However, we are still an economy dominated by manufacturing and industry, and our emissions profile looks different to other parts of the UK. Our emissions are concentrated around a few sites and a few sectors, with nearly half of our emissions coming from the power sector and a fifth from business, and nearly 2/3 of these coming from iron and steel processing. Nearly 60% of our emissions are covered by the EU emission trading scheme, over which we have very little control, and this is in comparison to the UK average of 29%. We've recently strengthened our legislative framework within our Environment Act, and that sets in place a long-term target of at least 80% by 2050 and a series of interim targets and carbon budgets. And this helps provide clarity and certainty for low-carbon investment. We were one of the first countries to legislate on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we have our own 7 well-being goals. So the challenge for us now is to be a leader in the clean growth revolution. So we've recently received advice from our advisory body, the UK Committee on Climate Change, along with wider evidence sources, so we can determine Wales's transition up to 2050. So at the end of this year, we will set interim targets to reduce our emissions by 27% by 2020, 40% by 2030, and 67% by 2040. And next year, I will publish the delivery plan for our first carbon budget. We're a net exporter of energy, which goes to the wider UK energy system. So this, combined with our emissions profile, means 80% emissions reduction in Wales will be more stretching than the equivalent reduction for the UK. And it's very close to the maximum feasible reduction identified in our advisory body's scenarios. So the UK government is aiming to phase out unabated coal by 2025. And as a government, we fully support this. We're also looking at Wales-specific levers to reduce emissions, such as the planning regime. We recently consulted on the new planning policies for both coal and renewable energy to support our decarbonisation policies. Our draft coal policy explicitly states proposals for open cast, deep mine development or colliery spoil disposal should not be permitted. All of this means a big change for how we produce energy and go from a dominant source of coal to other sources such as renewables, gas and nuclear. We're making good progress. In 2016, we generated 43% of electricity consumption from renewable energy. But of course, there is much more to do. So at the end of last year, I set renewable energy targets for Wales to generate 70% of our electricity consumption from renewable energy by 2030. 1 gigawatt of renewable electricity capacity to be locally owned, and all new renewable energy projects to have an element of local ownership by 2020. So in delivering our transition, we need to be very careful. We are not replacing dependence on one type of fossil fuel, coal, with another, gas. As a result of UK government decisions, Wales, with 5% of the UK's population, now hosts around 20% of the UK's gas-fired electricity generation. We recognise gas has a part to play in the near term, but in the longer term, we must ensure we host a more proportionate share of gas generation. Phasing out coal is not just about decarbonisation. It provides wider opportunities such as clean air, quality jobs and better health, and all help to deliver a better future. Ex-coalfield communities face significant economic and social challenges as a result of the disappearance of the main sources of employment, and I think that was very explicitly shown in the video we watched. Coal may be being phased out in the UK, but the legacy of closing those mines is still with us. So we must support those with the least resources to benefit from the transition. This is why supporting interventions such as retrofitting houses to improve the energy efficiency of our housing stock is such a key part of our approach. We continue to support research and innovation in industry and manufacturing, sectors which are very important to the Welsh economy. For instance, in the transition to a low-carbon future, we still need materials like steel. So we need to look at new ways of producing it, such as through electric arc furnaces, creating sustainable and integrated metals based on renewable energy and metal recycling. And we now have one based in Wales. So we are at the very start of that transition, but with a strong legislative framework, political leadership, and clear concrete actions, we believe we're absolutely on the right track. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now ask Candace Johnston of Alberta to come to the podium. Candace is the Director of Coal Transition in the Electricity and Sustainable Energy Division of Alberta Energy. In this role, she's responsible for leading the development of policy and legislation to support Alberta's climate leadership plan and the transition away from coal power to greener sources of electricity. Candace, please go ahead.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by saying thank you to the PPCA for providing me with the exciting opportunity to share Alberta's story. So I'm going to look at Alberta's electricity future and what we're doing to transition to a greener grid. I'll first start talking about our electricity landscape to give you a bit of context about Alberta's electricity market, move into our Made in Alberta climate leadership plan, and then finish up with discussing the goals, initiatives, and tools that we've implemented to transition our electricity system. So looking at Alberta's electricity landscape, as you can see, coal generation has traditionally been Alberta's primary source of electricity. As of March of this year, 38% of the province's electricity was produced from coal-fired generators. Cogeneration has grown in Alberta and is an important part of our electricity mix. And it's also worth noting that within Canada, Alberta's electricity system is unique in consumer type in that the majority of our power consumption comes from industrial consumers as compared to residential users. So Alberta has one of the strongest climate change policies among energy-producing jurisdictions. Our climate policy includes 4 pillars, as you see on the screen in front of you. So implementing a new carbon price on greenhouse gas emissions, ending pollution from coal-generated electricity by 2030, and developing more renewable energy to supply 30% of electricity generation by 2030, often referred to as our 30 by 30 target. Limiting oil sands extraction to 100 megatons per year, and lastly, reducing methane emissions by 45% below 2014 levels, also by 2025. So our government plans to phase out all coal-generated electricity pollution by 2030. This will be achieved by having 30% of Alberta's electricity come from renewable sources by 2030, allowing coal units to convert to natural gas where it's economically viable, and creating a market for private investment in technologies such as natural gas, cogeneration, or other technologies. Looking at our approach, the government of Alberta has taken a multi-pronged integrated approach in transitioning the province's electricity system that relies on the synergy across our goals, initiatives, and tools, and I'll walk through each of these in the next slides. So the goals that have been driving our electricity transition and the foundation of all of our decision is that our electricity system remains reliable, so that the power is there when people flip on the switch, that we reduce harmful pollution to improve the health of Albertans and the environment, that we have reasonable, predictable prices, and lastly, that we create a positive investment climate to keep Alberta competitive. Top experts in North America and consumer representatives have been consulted to build our plan. So looking at some of our initiatives, obviously at the top of the list is our coal phase out, and the government is working with companies to phase out coal-fired generation and encourage investment in the electricity system. Prior to our climate leadership plan, 12 of Alberta's 18 coal-fired units were already slated to retire by 2030. However, remaining 6 units would have continued emitting harmful pollution, in one case all the way out to 2061. In November 2016, the government of Alberta reached agreements with 3 power companies to end coal-generated emissions by December 31st, 2030. Agreement elements included transition payments, which are fully funded by Alberta's price on industrial carbon emissions for the 6 coal units expected to operate beyond 2030 to secure a positive investment climate in the province. We also included company obligation, which served to have commitments towards community investment, retaining a head office and a minimum number of employees in Alberta, and continuing participation in Alberta's electricity system. Moving to our price on carbon, in January of this year, the government introduced the Carbon Competitiveness Incentive Regulation, which compares facilities to the best performance in their sector. The regulation encourages achievable greenhouse gas reductions by incenting facilities to adopt best-in-class technologies while providing competitive protection to industry and recognizing best performers in a meaningful way. The revenues generated from the price on carbon enable programming that supports the main outcomes of our climate leadership plan, including reduced greenhouse gas emissions, a lower carbon diversified economy, and increased community health and well-being. Looking at our electricity market transition, in November 2016, our government endorsed our system operator's recommendation to transition to a new energy and capacity market framework. This was to ensure reliability as our system evolves, increase stability of prices, provide greater revenue certainty for generators, maintain competitive market forces and drive innovation and cost discipline, and lastly, to support policy direction and is adaptable for the future. The system operator is responsible for designing and implementing the capacity market. The process has included significant stakeholder engagement and is expected to take 3 years to complete, with a capacity market to be in place by 2021. Looking at the consumer protection side of things, one of our government's priorities is to protect consumers from volatile electricity prices. And to support this goal, we introduced the electricity price protection cap, which ensures Albertans will pay no more than 6.8 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity until May 31st, 2021. Moving on, looking at our renewable electricity program. On a utility scale, the program is encouraging the development of large-scale renewable electricity generation to add 5,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity by that 2030 mark. Our round 1 set a record for the lowest renewable electricity prices in Canada, with a weighted average price of 3.7 cents per kilowatt hour and total development of 600 megawatts. Moving on to round 2 and 3, which were recently announced, they will provide a total of 700 megawatts of renewable electricity with private sector partnerships, including Indigenous communities. On a smaller scale, the Alberta government is also making it easier for Albertans to generate their own electricity from greener sources such as wind and solar. Looking at community support, as highlighted in the video, the government is committed to supporting impacted communities during this transition. In September of 2016, the government announced a 3-member expert panel to meet with community, labor, and industry leaders in regions affected by the transition. The panel then provided recommendations to the government of Alberta to support these workers, communities, and First Nations. The government also launched the Coal Community Transition Fund, which has supported 12 projects in 17 communities across the province and includes total funding of about $5 million. Worker support. In addition to supporting communities, our government is committed to assisting workers during the move from coal-fired generation. The government established the Coal Workforce Transition Program to provide financial assistance for reemployment, retirement, relocation, and education as workers prepare to start new jobs or retire. These programs include Bridge to Reemployment, Bridging to Retirement, Relocation Assistance, and a tuition voucher. Lastly, looking at the tools that we've employed throughout our transition, the Climate Leadership Plan announcement marked a monumental shift in electricity system operations in Alberta's history. Since then, significant electricity transition policy and legislative decisions have been brought forward to Cabinet during every sitting. The importance of engagement cannot be emphasized enough as it serves as a foundation to our transition. The government of Alberta was intentional in providing opportunities for stakeholders to participate. This allowed many interested parties from around the world to participate and to be engaged on the emerging opportunities in our province. These opportunities for stakeholder participation were well received. In 2017 alone, over 700 individuals representing 276 organizations participated in a series of webinars, workshops, and other in-person sessions. The strong interest from stakeholders continues in 2018. We also established the Indigenous Electricity Technical Working Group, it's a mouthful, which now serves as a best-in-class model and optimal practice for Indigenous community engagement across the province. Looking at consulting experts, we leveraged the knowledge and expertise of subject matter experts throughout the transition process that included our climate leadership panel, energy expert Terry Boston, and the advisory panel for coal-impacted communities. Looking at subnational and national collaboration, Alberta actively engages with the Government of Canada to facilitate information sharing and foster complementary policy and legislative development. For example, our province worked with the federal government to support coal to gas conversions and establish provincial and federal regulatory clarity for coal plants to convert to natural gas and continue to operate past 2029. Lastly, one of the critical success factors in moving electricity transition policy and legislative items through cabinet included the establishment of senior level government committees. These committees serve to provide direction of option and recommendation pathways to pursue, inform decision packages before being advanced to cabinet, and ensure alignment across all relevant government ministries. Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Next up is David Downer from Washington State, who is chairman of the Utilities and Transportation Commission there and is also on the board of directors of the National Association of Regulatory Utilities. And the thing I wanted to perhaps draw out of David's background is he's an economic regulator, and I think this is something that, not an environmental one, and that's something that we're now facing where we're going economy-wide, and good climate policy is really just good mainstream economic policy. So it's particularly a pleasure to welcome David and his perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this important discussion. I think it's interesting that there was a UN Foundation blog that declared that the climate word of the year for 2018 is subnational. And I think that's really interesting. Certainly in the United States, where the government is pursuing policies that are promoting fossil fuels and opening public lands to drilling and so forth, I do think that it is important that states and cities move ahead with their laws and their programs and their policies to combat carbon pollution. But I don't want you to think that this is something that just started in 2018. In fact, in our society, I think everyone needs to contribute. And that includes national governments and states and cities and businesses and individuals and educational institutions and so on. In fact, for years, states and cities in the United States and also individuals and corporations have been leaders in taking action to address climate change. 29 states have had for many years renewable portfolio standards, which require that a percentage of their electric load be met with renewable energy. In my state of Washington, that percentage is 15% of load by 2020 must be met with wind and solar and other qualified renewables, and that's in addition to the 72% that in Washington is already being served by hydropower, since we had the foresight, unlike other states, to build a really big river through our state. So there has been a lot going on. You saw on the slide, Washington also negotiated with TransAlta for the shutdown of the Centralia coal plant. I played a small part in that. I'm very proud of it. I want to tell you that the video was a little bit misleading because it really doesn't have, there's not that much sunshine in Centralia. So when you saw the sunshine there, that's don't make travel plans based on the video. Okay. But that was great because we also, in that law, we basically set standards. There will never be another coal plant in the state of Washington unless they can really dramatically reduce their carbon emissions. Oregon has done the same with their only coal plant, Boardman, that will be closed by 2030. And after that time, they will not allow even the importation of coal in Oregon. That is, it can't be recovered in rates of electric customers. So, and we're looking at something similar in Washington. But the list goes on in state after state. We've got net metering laws to promote rooftop solar. We've got incentives for community solar. We have energy efficiency mandates. In fact, in Washington, our utilities are required by law to pursue all cost-effective conservation. And right now, we're achieving every year enough energy efficiency to power the city of Vancouver, Washington for a year. And it's going to continue to grow. We're just picking some of the low-hanging fruit, but there's a lot more fruit on the tree. We have appliance standards and building codes and so on. What I think is different in 2018 is a renewed sense of urgency. In Washington, we've just gone through an incredible summer. We've had forest fires, and which are just a record. We haven't seen anything like it, and it just started. I mean, I grew up in Portland, Oregon. We've never had summers like these. And we've had abnormally high temperatures. We've had haze, unbreathable air. So people are starting to realize, hey, this might be important. We might need to deal with this. Governor Inslee of Washington is in town this week to discuss the effects of ocean acidification and the impacts that's having on our shellfish industry. We have pine beetles that are ravaging our forests as well. They're not dying off in the winters anymore. The winters aren't either cold enough or long enough. So all of these things are impacting the state of Washington. We actually have a town of La Push, which is in the Quileute Reservation on the Pacific coast, that is being forced to relocate. They actually have to close their town and move up the hill because sea level rise is going to push them away. So the voters in my state are seeing a sense of urgency. They're going to actually have the opportunity to vote this November on whether to impose a tax on carbon. The legislature will be moving ahead this session on a bill to require that 100% of the electricity in the state by 2030 will be carbon free. And they're looking at additional measures to promote distributed resources, electrify transportation, and establish low carbon fuel standards and make building codes and industrial processes even stronger. And I mentioned electrification of transportation. And that's another reason why it's very important to get the electricity generation to be carbon free. Because if we're going to rely on it for our fuels, we don't want to be changing from a gas motor to a coal motor. We really want to make sure that our electric vehicles are run with clean power. So Nick mentioned that I'm an economic regulator, and I want to tell you why that's important. In the United States and in other countries, Canada, I know, every state and province has a utility regulator. And our job is to make sure that utility rates are fair, just, reasonable, and sufficient. And we're entirely looking at prices. So if somebody says, hey, in your job, what do you think about coal? My official position is, well, is it cheap? Is it cheaper than the other stuff? Because if it is, then I've got to say, okay, that's what we have. That's what's going to be there. And because I can't look at it and say, hey, it's really dirty, let's get rid of it. I just don't have the authority to do that. And in most states in the United States, that's the same. So what do we want to do? How do we want to deal with this situation? And first of all, we want to go to the legislature and say, hey, you need to do things so that we don't have to try and fit a square peg into a round hole through our regulatory processes. So, but if the legislature is not going to act, or if they don't act in all things, there's still things that regulators can do. Historically, we haven't been asking the right questions. So we hear, oh yeah, that's the cheapest resource. Well, is it the cheapest resource? So are we actually asking about risks? Because we know there's risks even if we don't have a clean power plan in the United States because Trump has pulled back on it, we know that there is risk in the future, that there will be environmental regulation. And we know that that risk is currently being considered in all commercial contracts. So why aren't we looking at that as part of our comparison of coal and other resources? Are we looking at the social costs of carbon? Historically, we have not. We have said, oh, those are external costs. That's not our business. Well, it really is our business. And in Washington is now one of 3 states in the United States, along with Minnesota and Colorado, maybe New York, who are looking at social costs of carbon. Basically, we're saying, hey, put another $42 a ton onto the price of that resource, because that's what we're assessing the social cost to be. Now, we took the federal government's, the Obama administration's calculation of $42 a ton. In fact, there's arguments that that's very low. Stanford has said, they did a study that said it's more like $160 to $200 a ton. But it's enough to get us started in looking at what these comparisons are. Are we looking at decommissioning costs? These plants are reaching the ends of their useful life, and you can't just shut them down and walk away. They're sitting on land that has to be reclaimed. They're sitting on land that needs to be cleaned up. There are ash ponds that need to be cleaned up. All of those things go into the price. Are we looking at the supply chain? Is the coal plant being served by a single mine that has itself some financial problems? There are a lot of mines that are going into bankruptcy right now, and yet these plants may be depending on them. Those are the questions we should be asking. So the other thing as regulators that we can do is we hear from the customers. Now in Washington, the large industrial customers, I'm talking about Microsoft, I'm talking about big box stores like Target, I'm looking at King County and other large government agencies. They're demanding 100% renewable or carbon-free generation from their utilities. Well, the utilities got, one of our largest utilities is importing coal. They said, we don't want to be part of that. So we're able to work with them and see how do we do this fairly. We don't want to have cost shifts, so the cost of those coal plants are ultimately going to be paid for by a single mom in Renton with 3 jobs and 2 kids. But we can work it out so that now we have what we call green tariffs, where a lot of these large customers are getting green power, only green power, from their utilities, and it's not affecting the costs that others are paying. So this is a transitional step, but it's one that we're able to do in Washington. Also, just want to remind you that individuals do make a difference, and so we implemented a voluntary green program. People can pay a little more to ensure that their power is renewable, and we have thousands and thousands of people in Washington who are participating in that. So there's a number of things, even though you're an economic regulator, it's a matter of asking the right questions. So I leave you with that. We're working at the legislative level and the regulatory level to make sure that we're getting where we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Not sure this is on. Oh, dear. Thank you very much, David. Apologies for this. Okay. All right, there we go. So now we'll move to New York. So Adam Zarofsky is with us. He is the Deputy Secretary for Energy and Financial Services in the Office of Governor Andrew Cuomo. In this role, he oversees energy policy and financial regulation in the state of New York, as well as a number of state agencies and authorities. And he also helps lead the implementation of Governor Cuomo's climate agenda, including the U.S. Climate Alliance commitment to uphold the Paris Climate Accords, as well as the decarbonization of the $200 billion New York Common Retirement Fund. So it's impressive. Adam, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Patricia and Nick, and to the Alliance and to Bloomberg Philanthropies and to all of you, frankly, for being here and for having us. On behalf of the state of New York, I can say unequivocally we are thrilled to be a part of this organization and this effort and this important work. And if I can, let me just start there, which is the question of this. we all know, I assume in this room, notwithstanding what's coming out of our federal government, that climate change is real, that it needs to be addressed, that a key part of that is powering past coal. I imagine I wouldn't get much resistance to those propositions in this room. And so the question then becomes, so then why is this such a big deal? Why do we need all to get together? Why not just, as the video was suggesting, saying, well, let's shut down the coal plants? Well, as I think the video did a terrific job, and I was having one of those moments of conscious recognition, because so many of those questions are the questions that come up every day in my job. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in my remarks here. But before I do that, I hope you'll indulge me, as others have done, in a little bit of statistics and touting of some of the work we think we're doing in New York that is helpful in this area. Because we've been very aggressive here, and Governor Cuomo has been on the front of this. So I'm certainly proud to be a part of that. When Governor Cuomo took office in 2010, there were 11 coal-fired power plants in New York State producing about 10% of our electricity. Today, there are 2 producing 1% of our electricity. And what's more, the bell has sounded. They're all gone by 2020 due to some regulatory initiatives we're undertaking right now. Some of that is, as those of you who know the industry are aware, is a function of basic economics. Coal's no longer economically viable in many situations. But some of it, and a lot of it, is due to actions that can be taken by government working with communities. New York was a founder of the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Emission Initiative, which of course, to Dan's point about social cost of carbon, incorporates the economic costs here. It's a cap and trade system, obviously. And the pressure on that has been part of the acceleration of the way we worked on. The other issue is political will. We mean it. I don't think anyone comes into New York State and says, yeah, I know you guys talk about climate change, but there's this great economic opportunity for us to do a coal power plant. I mean, they don't show up because they know we're not there. We're not interested in doing that. So that comes not just from political leaders, it also comes from constituents, it comes from activist groups, and I echo Dan's remarks that David's remarks of the importance of having individuals be a part of this solution, because we see it all the time. When we are done with those last 2 plants in 2020, New York State, with its 20 million people and its $1.7 trillion economy, will be, if not the largest, I think among the largest economies in the world to do away with coal. And we are proud of that. But I think, as I said in my opening, at some level that's the easy part, right? At some level, saying coal's a problem, we need to move on, is the part that you can kind of do and agree in fairly easy order. But the challenge is, and the video did a terrific job of showing that, is well, how do you move past that? How do you then address, and it's not just how do you keep the lights on. It's not just, well, what's the electricity source that's going to replace coal? It is the communities that are affected. It is the property taxes for the plant that are no longer going to be collected by the localities and the school districts of those issues. It is the jobs. It is the costs of bringing someone else in, because when you bring someone else in, you would think it'd be pretty natural to say, okay, we're going to get rid of that coal plant, we're going to put a wind farm or a solar array there. Well, you wouldn't think that you'd be astonished at some of the conversations I've had in my office around, well, not there, we're all for clean energy, but let's do it somewhere else. Let's move that around. And so as policymakers and regulators and concerned citizens, it is not enough to say, let's move past coal. It is enough, we have to figure out how to embrace the next generation. Because I will tell you, part of it is pretty easy. You say, well, let's put renewables in, and that's great. And we are committed to that. Governor Cuomo has mandated that by 2030, 50% of our electricity will be coming from renewable sources. That's something we're very proud of. We've made tremendous investments. We just announced this year a $1.4 billion investment in 26 facilities, or renewable facilities around the state, the largest state investment in U.S. history. So we're very aggressive on that front. That's fine. That's great. But beyond that, you also have to maintain the long view. And by that, I mean, here's the situation you have as, let's say, a policymaker. There's a coal plant. You're closing it. You want it closed. A developer comes in and says, okay, you guys aren't yet ready to power the lights nearby with only renewables. We need some source of base load. Okay. The local senator, state senator, or legislature says, these are important jobs in this community. That community got hit by this. If that plant shutters, the kids in school lose property taxes of X million. Is the state stepping in with those dollars? How are we going to deal with that? The developer says, I got an idea. We're going to repower with natural gas, partially, but we're also going to put a solar field on the property, sort of like we saw in the video, at least for the solar part. It's not an easy decision to then say, to not take that moment and realize how these people in these communities are talking about, that you're talking about are going to be affected, and not say, sorry, we can't help you there, because the challenge is you need to help people in the moment, obviously with their electricity and their needs, but you also, of course, have to keep your eye on it. If a gas plant goes up, is that going away in 10 years? When we move on to the next part of renewable energy, are we going to be able to say to the developer who put all their capital in and say, sorry, you got to close up now? So, as policymakers, we try to think about this from a broad transition perspective and not just a reactive, let's do away with coal and let's, say yes to what's going on now. So we've done many of the things. I don't want to repeat what you saw in the video, but in New York State, we've done a number of the things. We've tried to set up mitigation funds for localities to help them out. We've also brought to the table, and I was laughing when I saw the video, because I recently was involved and we hosted a Clean Climate Jobs Summit where we were trying to bring in some of the folks who had worked in this sector and say to them, well, here's how we're going to transition your skills, your jobs to the new energy economy. We are, the most prime example being, we are building a tremendous offshore wind industry in New York State, 2.4 gigawatts by 2030, 800 megawatts being procured now. And so the notion is, how do we transition these jobs? But on the stage, and this is funny, we had our state's leading representative from the Sierra Club and the head of the IBEW. And I didn't set them up to say this, but the head of the IBEW said, before we get going, I want to note that this might be the first time in history the two of us are actually on the same stage, right? Because when would you think that would happen? Well, the answer is now. And so I think what we can do as regulators and as policymakers is to really facilitate that conversation, to facilitate those transitions, keep our eye on the long term, make the investments that are necessary, but also recognize all the people that are affected by this. And so I return to my theme that I started with, which is that is why this alliance is so important, and the work is so important, and we're so thrilled to be here. Because the easy part is saying, let's move past coal. The hard part is sharing and learning as to how we do it responsibly, how we do it for everyone, and how we do it quickly, because we don't have a lot of time. So thank you again. I just would close on one other observation, if I can, which is that we think about this as a whole package, as I say, and that goes for the individual policies that we talk about too. It's when Patricia was kind enough to mention some of the work we're doing to decarbonize the pension fund for the state. And the divest is, again, sort of the point I was making before. The divest part of that gets a lot of attention. Everybody writes the news articles about that. But we're actually as interested or more interested in saying, well, this is a resource of the state. It's actually for the beneficiaries, the pensioners, so I should take that back. But it's a place where we can have impact. Isn't it important for us to be a part of investing in that future, right? It's not just about getting out of coal. It's about getting into where we're headed for the economic returns of beneficiaries, but also to help spur the very transition we're trying to make. So I guess my point, and I don't want to be over, to quote someone I'm a fan of, it takes a village. And it takes a village to do this, and so I'm really glad to be part of this village in working on that with you all. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam. Paul, you're next. As the Managing Director of the Rocky Mountain Institute and former Special Counsel to President Obama and other roles in the White House and the previous administration, Paul is going to probably mention this, managing the coal transition. These guys, Paul's team, are real experts in this area, so it's a real honor. Great to have you and your time, Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I first want to say congratulations to the governments of the United Kingdom and Canada for making the Powering Past Coal Alliance a reality. It's not easy to do politically. I know this from my time in the Obama administration. It required a lot of political capital to work on the coal issue that President Obama personally devoted to it. And, you know, coal has been the go-to fuel for grid-connected electricity in most of the world for 100 years. Phasing it out is a big project. It's a big project, and it is a difficult project because change is happening very quickly. And these are long life capital assets. So you're trying to do something hard. And I know it's harder in some jurisdictions than others. But the point is that we need our societies aligned around big changes and big projects. This has been difficult with coal. The narrative, for better or worse, that still has taken hold in the public sphere in the United States and elsewhere is the notion that there's a war on coal or there's a war to save coal. And this sort of adversarial framing is not particularly helpful, and it's not clear that it's working out great for industry, and it requires huge effort by the environmental community, and policymakers are the ones who are stuck in the middle. And policymakers who want to take up the goals of the Powering Past Coal Alliance need tools to help them push this transition along in a way that builds consensus in their societies. I think that's fair to say. So there's been a lot of great work done on some dimensions of this transition and smoothing the transition, in particular on the idea of a just transition for labor, right? So the layoffs impact, the impact on workers, the impact on communities, and that is supremely important. The thing that I want to just tell you a little bit about today is some work we've done on the other side of the equation from layoffs, which is write-offs. The impact of hundreds of billions of dollars of potential capital losses suffered by those who own these assets. And so you might think, well, why should I care about write-offs? Well, if nothing else, you should care because the prospect of these capital losses drives huge and vigorous political interventions by these incumbents in political systems, right? And that in turn slows the energy transition because, as you have seen unfolding in the United States or Australia or Germany, you know, the perfectly rational fight to preserve assets for economic reasons by the owners of these assets actually can slow the overall process of making and implementing climate policy. That's why you should care about it. You should also care about it because as fast as the economics are improving in the balance between coal and clean energy, they are not improving fast enough to retire the global coal fleet fast enough to keep us on a well below 2-degree trajectory. So interventions will be necessary, interventions, again, that build that sense of consensus in society. The way I think about it is that we need to increase the speed of capital turnover in the energy system. That's a good thing, and that's inevitable. But stranding assets and losing money is not a good thing in and of itself, and it should be minimized to the extent possible. And we should be working to try to minimize capital losses in the system for the sake of accelerating this whole process, just as we are working on the labor and community side to help smooth the transition there. So how do we do that? Well, we have some shining examples that have been discussed today of jurisdictions where this is already happening. And you know, there are other places in the world where this is a lot harder, frankly. It is a little easier to do this when you have an old coal fleet, as is the case in the United States. It's a little more daunting when a large percentage of your coal fleet is less than 10 years old. There's a lot of primary debt outstanding on these assets. They're perfectly new, technically capable facilities. It's a different project to imagine shutting down brand new or relatively new capital assets that have been planned to operate for 30 or 50 or 80 years and have only been operating for 5 or 10. So the challenge does vary greatly by geography. I'll skip past that. So what we've done in this piece, which we've put out some copies of and happy to give folks further copies if you haven't got one, is said, try to understand how this looks from the perspective of the asset owner. And think about what is it that's going to determine the attitude of an owner of a coal plant to the prospect of early closure. How do you make that asset owner indifferent to whether that asset continues to operate or not? It depends on the current financial performance of the asset. It depends on the prospect of future financial performance. Sometimes an asset owner is willing to let a plant lose money in the short term if they feel there's a prospect for that plant to continue and have a license to operate in the medium to long term. So understand what the options are from the perspective of, and what we do in this piece is, this playbook is say, think of it like a CFO, a chief financial officer of a coal plant or an owner of a coal plant. How does this picture look? Because unless you understand as a policymaker what that looks like, or an environmental advocate, it's going to be very difficult to sit on the other side of that table and come up with solutions that really work. Understand the things that affect the financial prospects for a coal plant, some of which depend on the market, what kind of power market is it, what's the role of the state, and some of which are really plant specific. And understand, what are the variables that you need to take into account as you formulate policies, whether that's moral hazard, right? If you're going to be reneging on contracts in effect as a regulator that have been made with plants, that could have a knock-on effect in other sectors and reduce investor confidence in your state or country more generally, for example. So to cut to the chase, we looked all around the world. We talked to about 50 policymakers, utility executives, and environmental advocates, and we found 10 different policy components that together form the basis of a playbook for not just current members of the PPCA who have jumped into the frigid water of and taken the leap, might still be shivering and needing a little bit of fortification, but more importantly, those jurisdictions whom you seek to attract into the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and whose policymakers are understandably anxious about how are they going to get incumbents to agree to do this. And so these 10, which I fear not, I will not walk through, but basically are arrayed on a spectrum between along which who is bearing the losses, because there will be losses. You can't pretend there won't be. There will be losses in many cases. To what extent is it the asset owner, all the way on the other side of the spectrum? To what extent is it the taxpayer or the ratepayer or the government itself? And the answer, these can be mixed and matched, right? Think of the example of the UK, for example, where there was a mandate to close that was announced, but it was combined with some really interesting components, including one that we call soften the landing. There were costs imposed via the carbon price floor, right? But then on the other hand, there were also alternative revenue streams offered to industry in the form of capacity payments to make things a little better in the short term and to, in my interpretation, sugarcoat the pill of the fact that these assets were going to have to close by a date certain. So if you can mix and match these. It depends on the geography, the power market type, the situation, but we wanted to put these out there as a first survey of what is actually going on out there in the world and what are different people trying. And we also go through a series of case studies, including Alberta, China, Chile, and Colorado. And we also have a little piece on the UK. So finally, we are trying to encourage a radically moderate approach to dealing with this problem. I think, again, the war for or against coal is not, in our view, necessarily a helpful paradigm here for large-scale societal change. And it does require policymakers and industry and environmental advocates to accept certain things that might not be part of their ideological canon, right? It requires industry to accept that coal is in structural decline and to take action based on that fact, as opposed to a hopeful notion that it'll all come roaring back one day, which it won't. Asset owners, that's what asset owners need to accept. And environmental advocates probably need to acknowledge that it's not like the monopoly man owns every coal plant in the world, and we should be gleeful if they lose money. In fact, quite the opposite. Losing hundreds of billions of dollars activates political opposition, and it's not a good thing to begin with. And so accepting that and trying to structure solutions around that is important. And for policymakers, telling it like it is, but having the courage, as you have had here on this panel, to face up to this challenge, knowing that you have a set of tools to work with, both in dealing with workers and communities and also the capital side, hopefully will be a contribution to what you're trying to do. So that is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So we now will move to our last panelist, last but not least, our partner, Bloomberg Philanthropies, represented by Colleen Reagan. The Powering Past Coal Alliance is very pleased to have partners like Bloomberg as part of the alliance. And so we're very pleased to be doing this event jointly with Bloomberg Philanthropies. So Colleen is head of the U.S. Utilities and Market Reform at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. She's based in San Francisco, and in this role she leads the team's analysis of utility and corporate energy strategy, power sector business models, and electricity market design. So please, go ahead, Colleen.
Great. Thank you, Patricia, and thank you all for coming to hear us speak today. I'm here to just talk purely about the economics of the coal phase out. Specifically, what's happening for the alternatives to coal? Why does it actually make financial sense today for utilities, for states, for countries to actually be thinking about retiring coal-fired power plants and installing other technologies? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done at BNEF on the cost of the alternatives to coal and how they compare. And I'll round this out pretty quickly, and then we're going to moderate a discussion. So without further ado, we've been tracking solar PV module prices just at BNEF for the past about 15 years or so. If we look back even farther, we can see a very dramatic decline in the cost of solar PV modules. This is going back to 1976. Since then, we've seen a 99% decrease in the cost of PV modules. Just since 2010, that cost has fallen by 83%. Why is this important? When we're thinking about retiring coal-fired power plants, we need to be thinking about where are we going to get our electricity from instead. Most places in the world, in the developed world today, electricity demand is flat. Other parts of the world, electricity demand is growing. So we need to be thinking about these alternatives. And we think that solar costs are only going to continue to fall as we continue to observe efficiency improvements as well as technological gains in the solar sector. On the wind side, we've had similar cost improvements, albeit at a slower rate. So when we look at $1 per megawatt, the cost of a wind turbine, we've seen over a 30% decline since 2010 in the cost of installing wind. But what's more important on the wind side, actually, that's worth noting, I feel like this doesn't really capture the full story here. What's also happening in wind is that wind turbines across the globe are getting significantly more efficient. So what this graph is showing you is the capacity factor of wind turbines across the world. So when we say capacity factor, think of it, what percentage of hours throughout the year are these wind turbines generating power? And 10 plus years ago, most of these wind turbines on average were only generating power about 20% of the time. Now most of these wind turbines are generating power 35% of the time. So every megawatt of wind has almost doubled its potential. Every new megawatt of wind is generating almost double as much as a megawatt of wind that was installed 15-ish years ago. And in fact, In a very fossil fuel heavy state like Texas, Texas has the best wind resources in the world. You actually see some of these megawatts of wind turbines in Texas are generating 50+% of hours in a year. So we've seen real improvements here in wind technology, in wind siting as well, that are really allowing us to be thinking about wind and solar too as viable alternatives to coal and even gas in many parts of the world. So what about when you're trying to actually compare apples to apples, the cost of installing wind and solar versus operating coal and gas? I'm going to go to China because China, we've talked a lot about just within the space of the coal industry, because they've been obviously installing a lot of coal plants in recent years, and many people are afraid that they will continue to install a lot of coal plants, which will delay the transition. And this is the case with many countries in Asia where electricity demand is growing rapidly. But if you look at the cost of installing new wind and solar versus the cost of installing coal and gas, you can see in China, if you just look at where these lines intersect, that already today in 2018, the median cost of installing, all-in lifetime cost of installing wind or solar, which are the blue and the yellow lines, undercut the black and the gray lines, which are coal and gas. So already in China today, they're thinking, actually, maybe instead of installing a coal plant, we should be thinking about installing wind or solar. Our lifetime costs will be lower. And as wind and solar costs continue to fall, this story gets even stronger. So we consider this sort of tipping point number one in the energy space. So you're not phasing out an existing plant here, but you are deciding not to build a new plant because it makes more sense to install wind or solar. But really when you see the transition accelerate is actually when the cost of installing wind or solar are cheaper than operating your existing plants. And this is something that we've already alluded to on the panel. This is something that companies that are thinking about installing or building a coal plant today need to be considering with respect to stranded costs. In 15, 20 years, will it be cheaper to install wind or solar than to operate that existing coal plant? This should give people pause. According to our analysis, we think in China, this crossover point, at which it gets cheaper to build new wind or solar than to operate your existing coal plants on average, comes around 2028, so in about 10 years. So if you're thinking about building a coal plant today in China, you should be really worried about this. And this we think in 10 years or so in China in particular is when you're going to see this transition accelerate, when the economics really start to make much more sense for building new wind or solar versus operating your existing units. So in China and in many parts of Asia, coal is extremely cheap, which does mean this transition comes a little bit later. But in fact, there are parts of the world where this tipping point, new renewables are cheaper than existing fossils, has already come into play. I'm just going to give one example just to bring things a little bit closer to home and to finish up my slides, which is Xcel Energy. It's a utility, for those who don't know it, it's a utility holding company which is active in many states in the Midwestern United States. And they have already seen wind and solar be cheaper than operating their existing coal-fired power plants. So most recently, Xcel's utility in Colorado, which is the one in the middle here, caught a lot of headlines because they've said that they're going to retire 2 coal units, 660 megawatts worth, spend $2.5 billion on 1.1 gigawatts of wind, 700 megawatts of solar, and I think 250 megawatts of batteries. And in the process of that, they expect to actually save their customers $213 million. And they're able to do this because the cost of some of those wind and solar bids are coming in below the cost of operating their existing plants. So I just mentioned Colorado, which is the one in the middle here, but you can see for Xcel's other utilities, which are Minnesota on the left, and then Southwestern Public Service, which is Texas and New Mexico, those blue lines are showing you where those wind bids are coming in. And the black is showing you the cost of operating Xcel's existing coal plants. So you can see here, wind is cheaper for them, many of their new wind plants are cheaper than operating their existing coal plants. So this tipping point for Xcel and many other utilities in the US are already here. And so from a financial perspective, of course, politics, jobs, it all matters, but from a financial perspective, you're really seeing this transition is going to accelerate, and it's already here. So I'll finish on that note, and I believe we're going to the moderated panel now, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Colleen. Well, what an impressive panel. I think we've heard a compelling case for why to do it, a lot of advice and value for how to do it, and an impressive story from our governments represented on the panel of just the work that went into designing these policies and the care that went into working with stakeholders. So this is the value of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, to share this kind of expertise. So I'm very pleased to give the audience now an opportunity to ask questions. Now, I just am signaling that we will have some mics to pass around. So I will now invite people to raise their hand, and we'll direct a mic to you. So over here on the right, go ahead, please.
Thanks all for the presentations. My name is Joseph Smythe. I write about utilities and electric cooperatives in the Rocky Mountain region at cleancooperative.com. Rocky Mountain region is especially reliant on coal, as you may know. I think this question is mostly for Paul, but maybe also for any of the regulators that have experience with this. First, congratulations on the report. It's super helpful for understanding the asset owner's perspective. I wondered if you have anything to contribute to this conversation about differences in the type of utilities that are owning these coal assets. In the US, we have investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities, and electric cooperatives with very different structures in terms of their finances and ownerships and regulation. So I wonder if you have anything to offer about how policymakers in particular and environmental advocates might engage with those asset owners vary based on the type of asset owner.
Thanks for the question. Yes, there are vast differences in the kinds of utilities that own these assets, the extent to which they're merchant, IPPs, the extent to which ratepayers, in effect, own the liabilities associated with the environmental or the cost liabilities associated with these plants, and also actually the whose capital is at risk, right? So think of the example of China or India, where state-owned banks are the ones exposed to losses, which is closer to home for the public, but also actually opens up new opportunities for problem solving. And one thing we've seen in China is one strategy for dealing with overcapacity in coal in China is not to talk about shutting down plants at all, but just to indefinitely idle them, right? If your concern is workers and having people paid to go to work every day, and you have the flexibility to do it, let people go to work, plant's not operating, the state, obviously the plant is not servicing its debt obligations, but the state-owned bank can roll bad debt forward. And in India, the state-owned banks have also had to do that. So yeah, and the right solutions depend a great deal on who the utility is and who's on the hook for both contractual obligations that may exist going out, like power purchase agreements, as well as on the financial side.
Thank you, Paul. Now we have another question over here as well. The front. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Mary Ann Hitt, and I'm director of the Sierra Club Beyond Coal campaign. So thank you for your kind words about my colleague Lisa Dix. She's a treasure, and for the film. A quick question about the alliance itself. Some of us were in Bonn when the alliance was announced, and it seemed like a watershed moment to have a formal diplomatic alliance of countries and states that are moving beyond coal. And so just a question about how, what effect you think that has had so far on the either in your areas or internationally on this discussion, that just the debut of the alliance itself, and what do you have planned, or what are your aspirations for it in the next year or two?
Thank you. Thank you. On the UK side, you're right. I mean, we were really pleased. It was described as the political moment of COP. Maybe there wasn't enough other stuff going on, but I think it really was, like you say, a really, really key step. I think one thing that struck me is how, a little bit to Paul's point, how positively it's been taken by countries, regions that have a real problem going forward. They haven't taken it as an adversarial or a demonizing of the challenge. I think we've been careful about the presentation of what it is and what it isn't. I think at the same time, it is, I feel, squeezing people. I mean, they see now the terrifying science, they see the economics that you've described so well from the Bloomberg side, and now there's the politics and the diplomacy and the kind of pressure there. We're going to get the 1.5 degrees report coming shortly from the UN, which will take us even a step further. So I think that it's got a lot of countries that I visit going, and I think even later this week we might hear from some surprising countries that have really taken this on board. And I think the second thing I hope is a tribute to this, what you've heard in the panel, is that it's a massive collaborative effort with thinkers, researchers, government and citizens at all levels. And if you look at the sort of analysis that's come out from Paul's Institute and how well that now dovetails with what governments are trying to achieve, it shows you that it's a kind of a huge collective effort. And then with your work and others like you, it all adds up to quite a coherent story. And I really think it was needed, because we've known for a long time that coal is just one of those huge issues that needs to be comprehensively tackled. The rate of change is nowhere near fast enough, and we just have to hope that some of the sort of unit cost stories that we've heard really result in a more dramatic transformation going forward.
Yes, I think I would just, in a nutshell, from the Canadian perspective, say that I think the alliance is there to signal that the transition away from coal is happening, that it is doable, that countries are undertaking this in large numbers, and that there's pathways to do it in a way that manages the risks. So another question from the audience, please. Who would like to go next? Here. Go ahead, please.
My name is Tatiana Lanshina. I represent an NGO from Russia that is focusing on the Sustainable Development Goal number 7. So far, you have been talking mostly on the electric power sector, and my question is, what's the role of coal in the heating sector in your countries? And whether it is significant or not, and what can be the solutions for phasing out coal in this sector. Thank you.
Okay, so who would like to take that? David?
Well, I just say in my state, coal is not a significant player in the heating realm. Most people get their heat from electricity, so I mean they don't directly burn coal in their homes, or from gas. In Washington, we do have several communities where folks are still burning wood, and so moving them off, we actually had, the legislature did some, passed a bill that was trying to transition them to gas. Now, actually, again, gas is still a fossil fuel, and the question is, should we be transitioning them to gas, or should we transition them to electricity and then clean up the electricity sector? And I think that that's where the debate is now in Washington.
Just to echo those comments, in New York, similarly, coal is not most people get their heat from oil and gas, which is not a great answer, obviously. But what your question really hits on is the larger point, which is that if you think of the approach to climate change and emissions as having three main components, right? Electricity generation being one, transportation being the second, and heating and buildings being the third. I mean, candidly, I think that's where we are not as, we need to do more work to move forward, because I think in electricity sector, as you're hearing today, there are challenges, there's mechanics, there's execution, but we all kind of know how it should go. I'd argue the same thing in transportation. But when New York City has 1 million buildings, many of which have been around for a long time and are not going to get knocked down and replaced tomorrow, how do we go about that? And so what we've tried to do, and are at least starting to do, is be very aggressive, as Dave was mentioning, on energy efficiency, right? That's the best place to start. And then start to think about ways to bring more electrification and have that sort of fold in with the broader effort that we're talking about. But your question is a terrific one in the sense of, we could talk about and electricity generation at some level is the low-hanging fruit in this fight, although don't let me say that too enthusiastically.
Thanks, David. Well, maybe I could throw a question to the panel, just because I think it's so important to take advantage of the enormous amount of expertise we have here, especially as we think forward to countries that may be thinking of joining the alliance, countries, subnational governments, cities. So any of you who want to answer this, like you to say, if there is one thing that you would say to a government that is considering taking the decision to transition away from unabated coal power electricity, one piece of advice that you would give them, either about overcoming challenges or about accessing the opportunities that come from this transition, what would that one message be that you would give them? Understanding this is a complex topic, but I think this might be useful to get your sort of top piece of advice. So who would like to take that?
I guess I'll start. I think that I always, as an economic regulator, think in terms of economics. And there are folks who look short-term and there are folks who look long-term. And a lot of these investments that people are making, they're not looking long-term. Again, when you look at the impacts on the Washington economy that comes from everything that is going on with ocean acidification and sea level rise and forest fires and the loss of our snowpack, which we rely upon for storage of water during the wintertime, all of these things, I mean, this is going to harm us a lot. And when we look back 20 years from now, if we're saying, oh, that was probably we should have transitioned off of coal at that time, and the cost would have been less. I really think we need to start thinking long-term when we're looking at these issues.
Thanks, David. Anybody else? Candace?
Yeah, I think as a policymaker, the one biggest piece of advice or one key challenge is always putting the best policy advice forward for the people you serve, which is the public. So regardless of what government's in place, what politics are at play of the day, I think it's understanding the analysis and the data and making sure that from a public service perspective, you're always putting the best advice forward and understanding that there's a lot of challenges that come with the transition that include polarity of outcomes and understanding the trade-offs and the balance that needs to come along with that. So I think it's that consistent message and always remembering the public is who you serve and to do the best you can for the public.
Thanks, Candace. The Minister.
Thank you. I would say it's to ensure that you provide new opportunities and new skills for the people who are affected by the closure of particularly the coal mines. So if you look back to the 1980s, and one of the reasons I first became involved in politics was because what the UK, we didn't have devolution there, Wales didn't have its own government, was what the UK government of that time was doing to our communities in Wales by just closing the mines, and there was nothing there for them. So I think the thing I would say is to make sure that you have the new opportunities and the new skills before you close those plants or those mines.
Great. Adam?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and I think others have alluded to it, is when thinking about climate change and in particular the issue of coal, the social cost right? Because oftentimes what's in front of you as a policymaker is the cost of the plant versus the cost of replacing it versus, sort of these hard costs, but making sure the social cost is part of your thinking. And social cost, candidly, is often itself thought in abstract terms. It's thought about, broadly, or climate change and these kind of broad words. And I think it's helpful to come back to, with coal, for example, the health effects, the amount of, and not just looking at pictures of people struggling with asthma, but also the costs of treating those people and the economic opportunity lost by having those health effects, and so on and so forth. So I think it's sort of trying to think concretely about the social costs as you're going through this, and that we try to keep that. I have it on my whiteboard in my office, that those two words, just because otherwise you're liable to forget them. So I would just encourage others to do that.
Great, thanks for that. So we have time for perhaps one or two more questions. I see a hand over there.
Hi, my name is Ariel Link, and I am a student at Colorado College studying environmental science with a focus on biogeochemical cycles. This was touched on a little bit, but I was wondering if the Alliance or any of the governments you work for have plans or initiatives in place to address health issues that have arisen from people living near the coal plants or communities that have been disproportionately affected by the pollution emitted from the coal plants.
Who would like to comment on that from our governments? David?
Well, again, is this on? Oh, you turned the button on. You're tricking me. There we go. All right. I'm not good with technology. This is the equity issues are big, and they are taking on more resonance and more salience as we get into them. Now, Washington does not actually have any coal plants but TransAlta, and the people who live near there are very strong supporters of the coal plants. Where I find the equity issues actually most interesting is we have Interstate 5 going right through the heart of all of our population centers, and it's the people who are living near the exhaust fumes of all of those thousands and thousands of vehicles that travel up and down who are at risk, and we know that the health effects of people in the proximity of I-5 are very significant. And that's why when we start looking at reducing the carbon in the transportation sector, that is a very big issue. The equity issue is really one that resonates. Getting the buses in municipalities to convert to being electric vehicles is also a big deal, so they're not idling outside of our schools. The coal plants themselves, the people who live around them, what we've found is even the coal that we're importing from Montana, the communities have really, they are focused on the economics. They've glommed onto those coal plants as theirs. They want to protect them because they want to protect the tax base and the jobs. So we haven't heard so much in those areas about the health effects. But the equity issues are huge. We do need to look at the health effects, and those are part of the social costs that my colleague from New York just discussed.
Got your name wrong earlier, so.
Just to build on that point, for those who are here and not as closely involved day to day, I mean, to pick up your point, there are 4 million premature deaths globally, and that's 1 million each in China and India and 2 million elsewhere. So the scale is not quantitative. I think that's what I took most from this panel. I don't think this is working, so I don't have to hold it in front of my face. But I will, just for the hell of it. Is that what's come out very strongly from the panel is part of the solutions that, as you've alluded to, is this full economic cost is still not really coming through. I think there's a lot of work being done, but the full health impacts is something, one piece of analysis that we've started to really see come through the system now, and we've got to continue to build in for the benefit of regulators and policymakers.
Okay, so we do have a closing speaker, but I think we have time for one more question before we move on. I see one hand over there, so please go ahead. This will be the final question.
Hi, Peter Erickson, Stockholm Environment Institute. I'm curious to what degree the strategies you've outlined here for coal power plants would also apply to coal mines. They're perhaps less capital intensive, so there's not quite the debt question, but there is the labor question. Curious if anyone would care to comment on that.
David again.
I can't, I need a microphone. Let's turn it off.
So what's interesting about the coal mines is, well, as a state regulator, we don't regulate the mines. We regulate the utilities that own the plants, and generally they don't own the mines, they contract with the mines, although that's not true in every case. But what we're seeing is the economics of the mines are degrading pretty quickly. We have a lot of coal companies that are in bankruptcy or facing bankruptcy. And the mines have been large employees, although they're getting more and more automated. But it's, I think that if the coal plant is shut down, then the mine is going to shut down unless they can figure out a way to export that. And again, the Washington experience, we recently rejected, or I should say our environmental regulators rejected the construction of a coal export facility because of the environmental impacts it would have on the community. But in terms of the economics of the mine itself, it's got to sell the coal somewhere, but if nobody wants the coal, then the economics are bad. Now, it's not something I don't have to worry about stranded costs of a coal mine in most cases, but it's out there. And I think the things that regulators do, or what we did with TransAlta actually had its own mine that it did own, and it had to shut that down, laid off 360 workers, and then it had to reclaim the property. And a lot of the people that were involved in working in the mine are now working on reclaiming the mine. So, in terms of what an economic regulator does, it's not usually factored into what we're doing.
Yeah, so in Alberta's case, we know that the coal plant closures also come hand in hand with a lot of our coal mine closures. So I'd say it's a holistic view of when we're looking at the economic and social impact of the closure, it's not just the plant, it's the coal mine and what the entirety of the closure has on the community. So it's never a discussion of, how many workers are being laid off at the coal plant, it's how many workers are being laid off at the coal plant and the coal mine, and so the programs and services we have offered for both the communities and the workers apply to both workers at the plant and at the mine.
Great. Well, I think this panel shows the wealth of expertise that members of the Powering Past Coal Alliance have to share, and that's been really thoroughly illustrated. So we have a closing speaker, and I will pass it to my colleague Nick to introduce him.
And this is my last intervention as a moderator, so just thank you so much again, Bloomberg, Philanthropies and Climate Works and all the panelists, and to all of you for coming. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Minister Dennis Norton from Ireland, a scientist by background, Minister for Communications, Climate Action and Environment. Delighted you could round this out for us, Minister. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks very much. I suppose it's not a good idea to let a politician know that you're actually finishing up early, because it allows us to have a little bit more time, but I'm not going to stray away from that. I'm going to be quite brief, and I'm going to maybe touch on something that is very relevant to the discussion that we had here today. And I think, the discussion in relation to the end of coal highlights the challenges that are out there. It's not just about power generation, but the other implications in relation to it. But I think there is now a determination there to move forward on this agenda. And I think the work of the Alliance and the support of Bloomberg Philanthropies in this area just shows that the momentum is now there to drive forward. The Irish government is keenly aware of the need for urgent action to address the critical challenge that climate change is. And we're committed to doing our part in addressing these particular challenges and drive the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. In March of this year, I was very pleased to announce that Ireland was joining the Powering Past Coal Alliance. I believe that the Alliance has a hugely significant leadership role to play in encouraging the global phase-out of the use of coal in power generation. We all know the science, and it's very clear. Coal phase-out must happen quickly if we are to have any chance of meeting our climate, the Paris Agreement objectives. For Ireland, while there are technical challenges because we're an isolated grid in the Atlantic, the commitment is relatively straightforward in that we import all of the coal that we consume. It's an issue that was addressed by some of the speakers earlier. It's not just the coal plants, but it's the other mining aspect to it as well. In February of this year, as a result of that, Ireland announced that through our new National Development Plan, we're committed to ending the burning of coal in our power plant, which is the Moneypoint Power Station, Ireland's only coal-fired power plant, by 2025, and replace it with sustainable alternatives. It's a significant infrastructural asset on our grid in Ireland, and there are challenges, I say, in dealing with it, but we're determined to do that. This represents an alignment of our domestic policy with the objectives of the Powering Past Coal Alliance. But more difficult for Ireland is the issue of how we deal with our own domestically produced fossil fuel, which is peat, which provides stability in regional parts of the country in relation to the grid, but is also a significant employer in the Midlands of Ireland, not just in relation to the power plants themselves, but in terms of the milling of peat that's going into those power plants. And we believe that the Powering Past Coal Alliance toolkit will be key to help us in actually achieving our objective of taking peat and dirty fossil fuels out of power generation within the next decade, while providing a just transition to green employment for the families that are so reliant on these jobs today. Sustainable jobs that meet the skills capacity of the existing workforce are a central part of this, but also to ensure that there is a future for the generations to come in those communities across the Midlands of Ireland, because the last thing we need to see is those particular communities turning into a dust bowl in the years to come. Within the coming weeks, we're going to actually set out a roadmap showing how we intend to achieve this within the next 10 years. We're also determined to go further, and takes up on one of the questions that was raised earlier, to take dirty fossil fuels out of our domestic heating systems. And we're determined to do that within the next 200 months. And the reason that we're determined to do it is not just because of the climate aspect of it, but because of the air quality aspect. In Europe, 4 people die every 5 minutes as a result of poor air quality. In Ireland, 1 in 5 children suffer from asthma. 1 in 11 people in Ireland suffer from COPD, which is having a huge impact on our health system. So by taking action in relation to coal and other dirty fossil fuels, we can improve air quality, improve health outcomes, and improve the health service for everyone. Because of that, Ireland stands with the Alliance in its goal of phasing out traditional coal power and the reliance on coal power in generating a sustainable and economically inclusive alternative. And we will continue to promote such vital cooperation, encouraging others to follow our example and to accelerate the elimination of coal-fired generation. And I think all of us working together, sharing our concerns, our issues, our experiences, and our solutions, can help to drive this agenda forward and take fossil fuels out of power generation in the not too distant future. Thank you very much.
Well, it just falls to me to thank all of our panelists who were fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wealth of knowledge. Thank you to my esteemed co-chair, Nick Bridge. Thank you to Bloomberg Philanthropy for partnering with us on this event. Special thanks to the teams in the Canadian and UK governments who worked so hard to put all of this together. And thanks to you and the audience for joining us today. I think you've seen a powerful illustration of the case for doing the transition and the strategies for making it a just transition.